Jonathan Mercer had everything. He had money, power, and a name that made people listen. But at 78 years old, standing in the middle of a big fancy party, he felt something strange inside. It was like there was a big empty space in his heart. Something was missing, but he didn't know what. That night, something caught his eye. It wasn't the shiny decorations or the rich people talking and laughing. It was a small table near the entrance. It had a simple hand-painted sign that read, "Donations for the Harbor House Veterans Shelter." But Jonathan didn't notice it because of the cause. He noticed it because of the man sitting behind it. This man didn't belong in a place like this. He wasn't dressed in a fancy suit like the other guests. He wore old jeans, scuffed boots, and a plain dark jacket. His hair was messy and his beard was a little wild. He didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't look nervous or out of place either. He just sat there, calm and quiet, thanking people whenever they gave a donation. Jonathan watched him closely. The man wasn't selling anything. He wasn't asking for favors or trying to get attention. He was just there. And yet, people were noticing him. Jonathan frowned as he saw an old friend, Evelyn Harrington, walk up to the table. Evelyn was a rich widow, and Jonathan had known her for years. She always came to events like these, but she never seemed to care much. She gave money because she was supposed to, not because she really wanted to. But something was different this time. As she spoke with the man at the table, her stiff, polite face softened. She listened to him, really listened. Then she reached into her purse, took out her checkbook, and wrote a big donation. Jonathan could tell, this time she was giving because she wanted to. Jonathan's grip on his glass tightened. He didn't like this. He turned to a guest standing nearby. "Who is that guy?" he asked, nodding toward the table. The man shrugged. "Just some volunteers. They let the shelter set up a table every year, but no one really notices." But Jonathan noticed. And he didn't like it. All his life, Jonathan believed that power belonged to those who earned it. Money, status, influence, those were the things that made a person important. Charity events like this were just a way for rich people to feel good about themselves. But this man at the table? He wasn't playing by those rules. He wasn't networking, wasn't trying to win favors, wasn't even trying to stand out. And somehow that made people pay even more attention to him. Then Jonathan saw something that made him even more annoyed. Rebecca Morrow, a young woman from a wealthy banking family, stopped at the table. She had grown up in a world where money meant everything. But as she listened to the man, something in her face changed. Without hesitation, she reached into her designer clutch, pulled out a neatly folded check, and placed it in the donation box. That was it. Jonathan had seen enough. He set his glass down and strode toward the table. His steps were firm and confident. He was going to put this man in his place. Jonathan stopped in front of the table. His presence was strong and commanding, just as it had always been in boardrooms and business meetings. The man at the table looked up and met Jonathan's gaze. But there was no fear, no nervousness, just quiet acknowledgement. Jonathan gestured toward the donation box. "Quite the setup you've got here," he said, his voice edged with sarcasm. The man nodded. "It gets the job done. The shelter needs supplies, blankets, food, medical aid. Every bit helps." Jonathan glanced at the small, simple table, then at the grand auction happening just a few feet away. Over there, hundreds of thousands of dollars were being pledged in minutes. He smirked. "I imagine the numbers are a little different over here." The man didn't seem bothered. "Maybe," he said. "But for the people we help, even a small donation can mean everything." Jonathan pulled out his wallet, making sure the people nearby were watching. Inside were crisp $100 bills, neatly arranged. He thumbed through them slowly, letting the light catch on them. Then, with a smirk, he plucked out a single dollar bill and flicked it into the box. "A donation for your noble cause," he said, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Don't spend it all in one place." A sharp silence followed. Jonathan waited for the man's reaction. Would he look embarrassed? Angry? Grateful but humiliated? Jonathan expected some kind of reaction, something that showed the man understood who had the real power here. But none of that happened. Instead, the man simply looked at the dollar bill, then back at Jonathan. And then he smiled. A real, warm, unshaken smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm and steady. "This dollar will help someone tonight. Every bit of kindness matters." Jonathan felt something shift in the air. The response was so simple, so genuine that it caught him off guard. He had expected to humiliate the man, to make him feel small. Instead, the tables had turned. Jonathan was the one who felt small. Nearby guests exchanged glances. And then, something even more unexpected happened. One by one, people stepped forward. They reached into their wallets, pulled out checkbooks, and placed donations into the box. Not because they felt pressured, not because they wanted recognition, but because something about that moment had moved them. Jonathan stood frozen, watching as his attempt to mock the man had resulted in the very opposite of what he intended. And the worst part? The man wasn't gloating. He wasn't smug. He hadn't even reacted to Jonathan's attempt to belittle him. He had just kept doing what he was doing all along, thanking each donor with quiet sincerity. Jonathan clenched his jaw, feeling something unfamiliar creeping up his spine. He had lost, and he wasn't sure why that bothered him so much. Jonathan tightened his grip on the edge of the donation table. The moment hadn't gone the way he had planned. Instead of making the man look foolish, Jonathan had only drawn more attention to him. One by one, more guests approached, slipping bills and checks into the box, offering words of encouragement. Jonathan could feel it. The quiet respect people now had for this man was undeniable, and that infuriated him. He wasn't used to losing, not like this. Jonathan forced a chuckle, shaking his head as if this was all mildly amusing. "Well," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper, "looks like you've got quite the operation going here." The man, still calm and unfazed, tilted his head slightly. "Just trying to help where I can," he said simply. Jonathan's jaw clenched. There was no arrogance in the man's voice, no attempt to challenge him. And yet, Jonathan felt a weight pressing against his chest. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks. "You must do quite well for yourself," he said. "Charity work can be lucrative in the right hands." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. They understood the insult, but the man didn't flinch. He only smiled. "Not everything has to be about profit, Mr. Mercer." Jonathan's breath caught slightly. He hadn't introduced himself. The man saw the flicker of surprise in Jonathan's face and gave a small nod. "I make it a point to know the people I speak to," he said, "especially those who hold influence." Jonathan slipped his hands into his pockets, masking his unease. "Is that so?" The man nodded. "Influence is a powerful thing," he said. "It all depends on how you use it." Jonathan let out a dry chuckle. "That sounds like something people say when they've lost." The man was quiet for a moment. Then, with certainty, he said, "Or maybe it's what people say when they've finally won." When they finally understood what truly mattered, Jonathan felt a strange feeling in his chest. It was tight, almost like something squeezing his heart. Jonathan had spent his whole life climbing to the top, making money and planning every move carefully. Every choice he made was about becoming richer, more powerful. But now, standing here in this grand ballroom, surrounded by shiny chandeliers and people dressed in expensive clothes, he faced a man who had none of those things. And yet, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, uneasy. He needed to take control of the conversation again. Jonathan looked around, taking in the fancy decorations, the gold and silver, the fake smiles, and the way people pretended to be generous. Then he turned back to the man in front of him and smirked, though this time, it felt more like a shield than confidence. "You talk about what really matters," Jonathan said smoothly, "but let's be honest. Money makes the world go round. You can talk about kindness and humility all you want, but in the end, power comes from money." The man looked at him for a moment and then chuckled softly. Jonathan frowned. "Something funny?" The man shook his head. "No, just ironic." Jonathan crossed his arms. "Explain." The man leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "You've spent your whole life believing that money is the most important thing. But tell me, Mr. Mercer, when was the last time you felt truly happy?" Jonathan's smirk wavered just a little. He wanted to answer quickly, to brush the question aside. But the Eleanor was, he didn't know. The man didn't say anything else. He just waited, as if he already knew Jonathan had no real answer. Jonathan exhaled sharply and straightened his posture. "You assume a lot." The man shrugged. "I just asked a question." Jonathan's mind raced, trying to find the right words to put himself back in control. Instead, what came out was something unexpected. "You think money means nothing?" The man shook his head. "No. I think money is just a tool. It can build, it can destroy. It can be used wisely or wasted on things that don't last." Jonathan scoffed. "And what exactly does last?" The man's expression softened. "What you give away." A silence passed between them. Jonathan felt something shift inside him. A small crack in everything he had believed his whole life. And it made him angry. He exhaled and shook his head. "Well," he said, forcing himself to sound casual, "I'll leave the philosophy to you. I prefer reality." The man smiled. "Reality has a funny way of catching up with us, Mr. Mercer." Jonathan hesitated before turning on his heel and walking away. But even as he moved through the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that for the first time, he had lost something he couldn't name. Jonathan Mercer was always in control. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made everyone listen. He used his wealth like a sword, cutting down anyone who stood in his way. But tonight something felt different. The man at the donation table, still calm, still unmoved, had left something in Jonathan's mind. And no matter how much Jonathan wanted to ignore it, he couldn't. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was worse. Doubt. He grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing server and took a big sip. Around him, people laughed and chatted, their voices blending into a dull hum. He should have walked away, should have drowned the moment in small talk and distractions. But his eyes kept drifting back to the man. Keanu Reeves. Jonathan had laughed at him, thinking he was just another nobody. But now he realized his mistake. Keanu wasn't just some charity worker. He was a man who had both fortune and humility. A man whose reputation couldn't be bought. And Jonathan had tried to humiliate him, right in front of everyone. No wonder people had gone silent. No wonder they had stared. The moment had played out like a cruel joke, and Jonathan had been the fool. He took a deep breath and straightened his tie. He had to fix this. With slow, deliberate steps, Jonathan walked back toward the donation table. The crowd had thinned, but a few people still lingered, dropping money into the box and speaking quietly with Keanu. Jonathan stopped a few feet away, rolling the stem of his champagne glass between his fingers. "You're still here?" he said smoothly. Keanu looked up and gave a small, knowing smile. "So are you." Jonathan clenched his jaw slightly. He hadn't expected that. He let out a short chuckle. "Well, I couldn't let our last conversation end so unfinished." Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded as if inviting him to continue. Jonathan took a slow breath. "I'll admit, I may have underestimated you." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" Jonathan smirked, though it didn't have the same arrogance as before. "I assumed you were just another charity worker looking for handouts." Keanu's expression didn't change. "And now?" he asked. Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't used to second-guessing himself. But something about this moment felt different. It demanded honesty. "And now I wonder why a man worth millions is standing behind a table collecting $20 bills." Keanu leaned against the table, folding his arms. "Because $20 bills matter." Jonathan scoffed. "Come on. That's not it." Keanu's smile was quiet, knowing. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "You could write a check that would fund this shelter for years. You could build an entire network of shelters if you wanted. But instead, you're here wearing worn-out boots, collecting small donations like they make a difference." Keanu held his gaze. "And what makes you think they don't?" Jonathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his silvering hair. "Because money is power. If you want to make real change, you don't do it in tiny steps. You do it in millions." Keanu nodded slightly as if considering Jonathan's words. Then he gestured to the ballroom, the sparkling lights, and the rich guests. "You said it yourself," Keanu said. "Money is power. You have it. So why haven't you used it?" Jonathan stiffened. "That's different. Is it?" Keanu asked. "Because I think the real difference is that I choose to be here." Jonathan's grip tightened on his glass. "What are you implying?" Keanu's voice remained steady. "Maybe power isn't just about having money. Maybe it's about how you use it." Jonathan felt a chill run through him. He had spent his whole life believing that wealth was the ultimate measure of success. That influence came from numbers, from owning things, from always being in control. And yet, here was a man who had all the money in the world but wasn't using it to control others. He was using it to help. Jonathan swallowed hard. "You think money doesn't matter?" Keanu shook his head. "I think money matters a lot." He glanced at the donation box, then back at Jonathan. "I just don't think it's the most important thing." Jonathan inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. "And what is?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "What you give." Jonathan let out a hollow laugh. "That's easy for you to say." Keanu shrugged. "Maybe. But that doesn't make it any less true." Jonathan stared at him, his mind racing. For years he had believed that success was measured in wealth. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Slowly, Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulled out his checkbook and filled out a check. When he finished, he held it up. $1 million, he said quietly. "That should make a difference, don't you think?" Jonathan took the check, looking at it quickly before putting it carefully into the donation box. He swallowed hard, feeling something strange in his chest. It wasn't pride. It wasn't power. It was something else, something that made him feel lighter, like a big weight was finally gone. As he turned to leave, Keanu's voice stopped him. Jonathan. Jonathan hesitated and looked back. Keanu gave him a small, real smile. Thank you. Jonathan didn't say anything. He just gave a quick nod, then walked away, leaving behind years of chasing success the wrong way. Jonathan Mercer sat alone at a table in the corner of a big, fancy room. He had a drink in front of him, but he didn't really want it. Around him, people were talking and laughing, but he didn't feel like joining them. He was used to being the most important person in the room, the one everyone looked up to. But tonight felt different. Something had changed. He had come expecting to feel powerful. He had written a check for $1 million. That should have made him feel great. It should have reminded everyone how rich and important he was. But instead, as he watched Keanu Reeves smiling and talking to people, Jonathan felt strange. Keanu didn't need the check. The shelter did. The people it helped did. But Keanu? No. He would have kept collecting small donations all night, shaking hands and thanking people with the same kindness. He didn't need Jonathan's money to prove anything. That meant the check hadn't really changed the shelter. It had changed Jonathan. Penny for your thoughts? Jonathan looked up, surprised. Keanu was standing there, holding a glass of water, his face calm. His eyes looked at Jonathan with something Jonathan wasn't used to seeing, understanding. Jonathan motioned to the empty seat. Do you always check on people you embarrass in public? Keanu smiled a little as he sat down. Only when they look like they need it. Jonathan let out a dry laugh. Aren't you kind? Keanu took a sip of water. That's the idea. Jonathan studied him. He wasn't sure what he expected from Keanu, but it wasn't this. Keanu didn't look smug. He didn't look like he was trying to prove anything. So, Jonathan said, crossing his arms. Are you here to brag? Keanu shook his head. No. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Then why are you here? Keanu leaned forward slightly. Because I know what it's like to feel the way you do right now. Jonathan let out a sharp laugh. I really doubt that. Keanu tilted his head. Maybe not exactly the same way. But I know what it's like to chase something so hard that you forget who you are. Jonathan tightened his grip on his glass. And what do you think I lost? Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room. It was still full of laughter, fancy lights, and important people. Then he turned back to Jonathan. When was the last time you did something that made you happy? Jonathan scoffed and shook his head. Happiness is overrated. Keanu smiled. That's what people say when they don't have it. Jonathan frowned. You think I'm not happy just because I'm rich? Keanu's face stayed calm. I think you don't know what to do with happiness. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't like this feeling. He had spent his whole life building his business, making more money than most people could ever dream of. He had won. But for some reason, answering Keanu's simple question felt impossible. Keanu must have seen something in Jonathan's face because his voice softened. You're not the first person to think success and happiness are the same thing. And you won't be the last. Jonathan smirked. And let me guess, you figured out the secret to life? Keanu chuckled. No. But I figured out what doesn't matter. Jonathan's smirk faded. He leaned in. And what's that? Keanu gestured to the fancy room. All of this. The need to prove something. To be the biggest, the richest, the most powerful. He shrugged. It's exhausting. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that Keanu was wrong. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down he knew Keanu was right. It was exhausting. He had spent his life making sure he always won, always stayed on top. And for what? Keanu broke the silence. It's not too late to figure it out. Jonathan let out a breath and shook his head. And what? Give everything up? Become a monk like you? Keanu laughed. I'm not a monk. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Are you sure about that? Keanu smirked. Pretty sure. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his face. He felt tired, not just tonight but all the time. He looked at Keanu. You actually believe all this, don't you? Keanu nodded. Yeah, I do. Jonathan studied him for a long moment, then let out a small laugh. You're a strange man, Reeves. Keanu grinned. I get that a lot. Jonathan shook his head and finished his drink. For the first time in years he felt lighter. Keanu stood and slid a small business card across the table. Come by the shelter sometime. No cameras, no reporters. Just see what it's like. Jonathan looked at the card. He should have ignored it. He should have laughed. But instead he picked it up. Keanu patted his shoulder. Think about it. Then just like that he was gone. Jonathan sat there for a long time, turning the business card over in his fingers, wondering what came next. Jonathan Mercer was always in control. Every move, every decision, every dollar he spent had a purpose. There was never room for doubt. And yet, as he stood outside the Pine Street shelter, holding the card Keanu had given him, he felt something new: hesitation. A whole week had passed since the charity event. A whole week since he had written that check and walked away feeling like something had changed. He had tried to forget it, to throw himself back into his business. But Keanu's words wouldn't leave him alone. When was the last time you did something that made you happy? Jonathan had power, money, and success. But as he looked at the worn-down building in front of him, he realized something. He had no idea what happiness actually looked like. The shelter was small and simple. No fancy decorations, no big news cameras. Just a place where people came because they had nowhere else to go. Jonathan hesitated for a moment longer, then exhaled and stepped inside. The air smelled like fresh coffee and warm food. People sat at tables eating quietly. Some wore old clothes, some looked lost. Jonathan had seen struggle before, but never like this. "Didn't think I'd see you here," a voice called. Jonathan turned. Keanu was there, rolling up his sleeves, stacking supplies. He looked the same as he had at the gala, calm, warm, unreadable. Jonathan smirked. "Don't get too excited, Reeves. I'm just looking." Keanu grinned. "Looking is a good start." Jonathan followed as Keanu showed him around. He saw how the shelter worked, how people helped each other, how donations kept it going. His businessman mind saw problems, things that could be done better. "This place is barely running," Jonathan muttered. "You need more money, better systems." Keanu smirked. "You see problems. I see people doing their best." Jonathan scoffed. "Trying isn't enough." Keanu stopped and faced him. "It is for the people who come here with nothing." Jonathan watched a mother hold her child's hand tightly, whispering, "Thank you," to a worker. And suddenly he wasn't so sure anymore. Keanu's voice was calm. "You still think money is all that matters?" Jonathan exhaled. "Money fixes things." Keanu tilted his head. "Then why hasn't it fixed you?" Jonathan had no answer. Keanu smiled. "You want to help? Then help. Not with a check. Just sit. Listen." Jonathan hesitated. Then for the first time he did. They walked back to the big room where people were giving out dinner. Keanu gave Jonathan a plate and told him to follow. Jonathan sat across from an old man with rough hands and sad eyes. His name was Frank. He used to be an electrician, but he got hurt and couldn't work anymore. He lost his house because he couldn't pay his bills. Frank took a bite of soup and said, "It's funny. You work hard all your life thinking you're doing everything right. Then one bad thing happens and suddenly none of it matters." Jonathan felt sad. "That's really tough." Frank laughed. "You don't have to pretend, son. It's awful." Jonathan had spent his life around tough men who never showed weakness. But Frank was different. He had lost everything, yet he could still joke while eating soup. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan didn't know what to say. Keanu sat beside him, watching. "Do you understand now?" he asked. Jonathan swallowed. "I think I'm starting to." Keanu nodded. Jonathan wasn't sure what was changing inside him. He didn't know what to do next. But he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore this feeling. And maybe he didn't want to. 3 months later, Jonathan sat at his desk, looking out the window at the city. The sun was setting, making everything glow gold. His office was at the top of a big company, one of the most powerful in the country. It was everything he had worked for. It was his kingdom. But now it feels empty. It had been 3 months since he went to the Pine Street shelter. 3 months since he met a man in an old flannel shirt who made him question everything. And in those 3 months, something inside him had changed. He let out a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. His desk was full of important papers, contracts, reports, business deals. But none of it felt as important as the thought in his head. He had to go back. The idea annoyed him. Jonathan was always sure of himself. He made decisions quickly and never looked back. But this was different. With a sigh, he grabbed his coat and left the office. As he drove, the street seemed different. Or maybe he was different. The tall buildings, bright lights, and busy people had always been normal to him. But now he noticed things he had ignored before. A man sleeping in a doorway. A woman pushing a cart full of her belongings. A little boy holding his mother's hand, walking quickly through the cold. Jonathan had always known these people existed, but he had never really seen them. Now he did. When he reached the shelter, it looked the same. No fancy signs, no flashing lights, just a place for people who had nowhere else to go. Inside, the smell of warm food filled the air. Volunteers handed out meals and talked to the people. It didn't feel like a sad place. It felt strong. Even though life was hard, people here kept going. Jonathan looked around and saw Keanu Reeves. As always, Keanu wasn't trying to stand out. He was just there talking and listening. Keanu noticed Jonathan and smiled. He walked over. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said. Jonathan smirked. "Yeah, me neither." Keanu studied him, then pointed at an empty chair. "Are you hungry?" Jonathan hesitated. Then he nodded. "Why not?" They sat at a table with others. Frank, the electrician. Maya, a young woman working 2 jobs. And Eleanor, an older woman who had lost her pension and had nowhere to live. As they ate, Jonathan listened. Their stories weren't just sad tales. They were real life. A bit of bad luck. A wrong choice. A moment that changed everything. But they weren't broken. They weren't waiting for someone to save them. They just needed a chance. When dinner was over, Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "All right, Reeves," he said. "I give up." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Give up on what?" Jonathan sighed. "On pretending this doesn't matter." Keanu grinned. "Good. That's a start." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "But I don't know what to do next." Keanu nodded. "You're a businessman. You solve problems. Start there." Jonathan thought about it. His brain, always focused on deals and money, started to see a plan. The shelter needed more money. Their job program needed better connections. "I can help," Jonathan said almost to himself. Keanu smirked. "I know." And that's how it started. Jonathan didn't just write a check. He got involved. He found companies willing to help. He made sure the shelter had steady funding. He connected the job program to real businesses so people could get real jobs. He didn't do it for fame. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about getting credit. He did it because it felt right. Months passed. The shelter improved. More people got jobs. More lives changed. And Jonathan? He changed too. His fancy suit stayed in the closet more often. His business meetings weren't just about money anymore. He still ran his company. He still made deals. But his idea of success was different now. One evening, as he was leaving the shelter, he found Keanu sitting outside watching the sunset. Jonathan sat beside him. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" Keanu chuckled. "Not really." Jonathan smirked. "I still don't get how you do it." Keanu turned to him. "Do what?" "Be this, content. Like none of the nonsense matters." Keanu thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I've lost enough in life to know what really matters. And it's not money. It's not titles." He nodded toward the shelter. "It's this. People. Moments. Connection." Jonathan was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, he said, "I think I get it now." Keanu smiled. "Good." As the night settled in, Jonathan looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel in control. He just felt at peace. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. Thank you for reading this story. This isn't just a story about money or success. It's about choices. About the kind of life we build. About what really matters. Jonathan spent his whole life thinking money made him important. But in the end, he learned the Eleanor, real wealth isn't what we keep. It's what we give. Life is short. Money can't buy time. It can't buy a real connection. It can't buy meaning. But kindness, time, helping others, that's what really matters. We all have something to give. It could be money. It could be kind. It could be just listening. But what we give, that's what makes a difference. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.